we turn our attention to what might be called the libertarian left, or more popularly, anarchism.
This is the same logic shared by Marx and Freud.
Functioning libertarian socialist institutions, I think they are an interesting model that I think is highly relevant.
Okay, so I was telling you a few days ago, I've been reading about postmodernism, and I'm doing stuff in my chapter about time and space, and it's a lot.
It sounds like a lot, yeah.
And Walt Benjamin's name came up, and I was like, oh, hi, I'm so smart.
Benji is in all good things.
So today we are looking at Epistemology of the Closet, which is written by Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick. And Sedgwick was an American academic and a theorist whose work is popular in the fields of gender studies, queer theory, and critical theory. Sedgwick lived from 1950 to 2009, grew up in Dayton, Ohio, and also in Maryland. Maryland?
You had to pretend you're like Southern. Maryland. That was bad.
Well, anyway, that's where she lived. She also studied at Cornell University. She got her PhD at Yale and taught at kind of a number of universities, including Boston University, Dartmouth College, Duke University, and City University of New York. Paula, I know you were looking at some interesting information about kind of Sedgwick's more personal life.
Yeah, so Sedgwick was in a straight presenting relationship. She was married to her husband for 40 plus years. And it's sort of brought up when you discuss Sedgwick because, Epistemology of the Closet, Tendencies, these are all works focusing on homosexual men. Not homosexual women, homosexual men. And I just wanted to talk about this, well, not talk, but mention that we're not going to be speculative about her personal life. We really actually don't care. But she is writing about homosexual men in the 90s during the AIDS crisis in Reagan America. And she is seen as a straight woman, quote unquote. We don't know, and it's not our position to theorize or to even suggest an idea that she wasn't in a straight relationship, but it adds a really interesting point to the works that we are talking about today. Specifically, that the term queer was not really used yet to describe non-heteronormative presenting people. And instead, she relies on other language for separating sexuality and gender. And, trans people were starting to become more well-known within the field, and we were starting to use terms. Specifically, I say we as in the West, because this is an American writer. This is very Western. This is post-structuralism Western. So this is right after our good old daddy Foucault. But I think it's really interesting how she's not using the word queer, and it's making me think about the way I write and starts separating sexuality and gender presenting and all these really great terms that we have that we're kind of throwing just a plain blanket queer over. So I thought that was a really interesting little note and tidbit. And I think it really works because she is a straight presenting woman in a way. And I think it's really interesting. What do you think?
Yeah, I was just going to say about the heteronormative, just in case people are unaware of that term, just because. Ooh. So heteronormativity, if you're not aware, is the assumption and promotion of heterosexuality in society and the normalization of this assumption. For example, heterosexuality is not questioned or interrogated as its own sexuality. It is the bar at which everything else is kind of set.
So there's also the term homonormativity, which works similarly, and that is used in possibly our future reading called Cruising Utopia by Jose Esteban Munoz. It's a fascinating one. But these are terms that we're quite familiar with given our educational background and what we work in. So if we throw around these terms and then you're like, hey, can you please go back and tell us what these mean? Please let us know. Because sometimes we kind of get lost in shop talk.
And so not to describe something as non-heteronormative then is it's not quite straight, or it doesn't read as a straight relationship. So for example, I believe you were telling me that Sedgwick was with her partner for 40 plus years, but they didn't live together. They kind of lived, was it like separate lives?
Well, they had separate apartments or flats if you're here in the UK. They lived in the same area of Union Square, New York, which is a pretty big area in terms of New York. But yeah, they lived in different apartments and they really respected each other's spaces because she worked a lot. But you mentioned her work and where she worked, and she was consistently everywhere doing so much stuff. So she kind of had her own space. And that goes into non-heteronormativity, even though it's a straight presenting relationship, because they're not doing the nuclear structure. Specifically in America during this time period, they were married in the 60s and they've been doing this up until the 2000s. That is not the norm within the States, not even within like major cities. So I thought that was a really interesting like little way to also introduce non-heteronormative heteronormativity.
Yeah.
The binary.
The binary. We've been talking a lot about the binary today. So Sedgwick's work is considered really groundbreaking, particularly in queer theorist circles. Queer theory, it's really indescribable, but it's kind of indescribable on purpose. Let's just say that queer theory, it tries to capture almost the outside of things.
It's kind of like the Schrodinger's cat situation, where the cat is neither alive nor dead. It's just in a state of existence somewhere between those two things. And I think that's kind of queer studies, because it describes, but it doesn't prescribe anything. It's kind of, I don't know how to describe queer studies. It changes by the text.
Yeah, let's just say that it's used to really deconstruct things. It's used to really question. It's used to push the boundaries, to think outside. It was traditionally kind of attached to sexuality and gender, but it doesn't just have to focus on sexuality and gender. I'm not really going to go into it too much more because it's not really relevant. We're about to discuss Sedgwick's work. Sedgwick is kind of considered a forerunner of kind of one of the founders of queer theory. And so you're going to see queer theory in action rather than me trying to describe what queer theory is.
And also, we're talking about queer theory in a way that this is an extremely Western approach.
Oh, yeah.
This is all basically rooted in, once more, Foucault. He always shows up. This is based, queer theory sort of stems from History of Sex, Volume 1. And it started, or I don't want to say it started, but it did bulldoze a new field. And this is where Sedgwick is coming from. And these were students during Foucault's time taking in what Foucault was writing and then producing their own works. Yeah. So these are extremely interesting responses, but once more, this is very, very Western. And dare I say, this is extremely American. Yeah. This text is absolutely American.
We're going to cover in the future potentially queer texts that go beyond this kind of Western boundary, because there are a lot out there. They're really interesting. Queer theory was kind of a Western construction. So there are texts that have gone and took queerness beyond this Western construction. But Eve, like I know Eve.
Besties, Eve.
Sedgwick is writing from an American point of view. That's the best thing to say. Oh, by the way, I'm sorry if my feet stink.
Oh, mine's small as well.
Oh, they do.
The Stinky Foot Podcast.
Yeah. Sedgwick's written loads of texts, some of her most popular being Between Men, English Literature, and Male Homosocial Desire. Tendencies, which is a really beautiful text.
It's so good.
Yeah, really raw, really stunning piece of writing. So if you ever get the chance, please read that. And Epistemology, the Closet, which is topic of today's episode. So Epistemology of the Closet was published in 1990, and so was kind of born out of a context in which homophobic attacks were very commonplace. The AIDS epidemic had been decimating communities for years, and LGBTQ plus rights movements were really in full swing. It's also born during a space, like we were saying, where queer theory was really coming into its own. And of course, as forerunners for this kind of work, there were other people writing kind of queer-ish texts and stuff like that. But the 1990s is kind of commonly spoken about as the time where queer theory really emerged explicitly in the West. So Paula knows more about US history than I do. So maybe give a bit more context here.
Yeah, this is coming out in the 90s. So this is Reagan's final term. This is also the rise of the evangelical right in the United States. And they, like you said, the AIDS epidemic is hitting, and it was called gay cancer because they use the AIDS epidemic as like God striking down on the wicked. And it was, of course, the AIDS epidemic was hitting the big cities, Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York City, because these were the safe havens for people of LGBTQ status. So they were calling these places Sodom and Gomorrah, and that this was God's spiting them and sending them down to hell because of how they live their life. So this is a really horrible time in modern history. And even now, it's kind of looked at in a really peculiar way in that, of course, we celebrate Pride. We're recording this during Pride Month. And it's extreme commercialized, rainbow capitalistic intentions. And a lot of these narratives are really lost. So with the epistemology of the closet coming out, even the name of it itself, it is commentating on the situation of the 90s, where being gay was a death sentence in the eyes of the heteronormative people of America. And this is beyond just left and right. If you were straight, you felt safe that you were not going to be, you weren't dying. So I think it's a really fascinating text. And I think it goes back to also Eve Sedgwick being a queer theorist as a straight presenting woman. It's absolutely fascinating. And dare I say, at that time, it might have been even powerful to have a woman speaking that was a straight presenting woman on behalf. Yeah, it's a really dark time.
Yeah. So Epistemology of the Closet's kind of central theme and focus is thinking about the connection between sexual orientation and gender, and how sexual orientation has become more associated with the individual and the idea of self and personhood. We're going to really go into this. But Sedgwick basically said that we need to untangle sexuality and gender, otherwise heteronormativity will remain in place. Important to mention is also this metaphor of the closet, which is really integral in Western culture. You step in and out of the closet. You come out the closet. It's
you hide in the closet.
Yeah, you hide in the closet. It's a metaphor that's kind of commonly used in Western culture. And we're going to discuss more about this later on. We're kind of going through the different parts. But this episode is going to be part 1 of our discussion of epistemology of the closet, as we chose to split the book in 2 in order to make it easier for us to discuss. This episode focuses on the introduction, chapter 1 and chapter 2. And by way of making it easier to follow along, I'm going to be summarizing kind of each chapter before we break into discussion. So, the long introduction, it's like 60-something pages.
She's hefty.
It's exhausting.
She's lifting.
Yeah.
She had leg day.
It kind of presents us with Sedgwick's methodology, which is deconstruction. And this is a method that focuses on breaking something down into its smaller parts to understand how that thing came to be. In this instance, the something in question is the binary between homosexuality and heterosexuality. There's other binaries discussed, but this is like the main focus. Also note that this kind of text focuses almost exclusively on male homosexuality. It also introduces us to various axioms And axioms are things that are self-evident or unquestionable, unmovable. And this kind of, these axioms underscore Sedgwick's work, both in this book, but also in future texts.
Yeah.
And it's kind of long, but I think it's worth kind of reading out these different axioms to kind of bolster what we're about to say in other ways.
And before we begin saying and reciting the axioms like some form of prayer, honestly, I think it counts as like queer prayer. The reason like the introduction is so long is because she breaks down each axiom. So it's not just her stating these as absolute truth. She's also giving you a reason. While we're not going to discuss every single axiom because then this will become a 45-part podcast, we will read all of them. And if you're more interested in this, you can always search for the text. It is behind a paywall.
Yeah, I have to pay, but this is such a major text, you'll probably be able to get it secondhand.
Or hit up your local library.
Libraries. Yes.
Yes, support the librarians.
So, now let us recite
From the book.
from the
The
book.
book of Epistemology of the Closet.
So, axiom number 1, people are different from each other. It's not groundbreaking, but it is true.
So true, bestie.
Number 2, the study of sexuality is not coextensive with the study of gender. Correspondingly, anti-homophobic inquiry is not coextensive with feminist inquiry, but we can't know in advance how they'd be different. Basically, sexuality and gender are not the same thing, and feminist and anti-homophobic research is not the same thing. Number 3, there can't be a priori decision about how far it will make sense to conceptualize lesbian and gay male identities together or separately. I feel like that speaks for itself. Number 4, the immemorial, seemingly ritualized debates on nature versus nurture take place against a very unstable background of tacit assumptions and fantasies about both nurture and nature. Just to give a bit more context for this one, it's things like the idea of the gay gene, born this way. We're going to talk a bit more about that a bit later. Number 5 is the historical search for a great paradigm shift may obscure the present conditions of sexual identity. So this is the idea that we don't know sexuality in full. We will never know. So trying to kind of search for that time of, we know it, is kind of pointless. Number 6, the relation of gay studies to debates on the literary canon is and had best be torturous.
So true, bestie.
Fan fiction.
Oh, we'll get to that.
Number 7, the paths of allo-identification are likely to be strange and recalcitrant. So are the paths of auto-identification. It's complicated.
Yeah, I thought there were more axioms.
No, I think that's it. That's it for the axioms. That's
That's
only
it?
7. It's just a long chapter.
It's just a lot of axioms.
So, how did you feel?
Okay, when I first saw the 60-page count for the introduction, I was like, oh no, absolutely not. But it was actually, the introduction is my favorite part of this book thus far. I had read this book before, but I was an undergrad and I don't think I understood anything that I was reading. So I kind of came to this with like a fresh set of eyes and a little bit more knowledge. I thought it was fascinating, and she cemented her thesis very, very obviously. In my notes, I put, Sedgwick cements this book will not concentrate upon sexuality. It will concentrate upon sexuality, not upon gender. And she articulated it and made it very clear and very understood. She also said the gendered weight of the term gay and homosexual as referring to cis males rather than all-encompassing. It was a really interesting way to sort of go off on her book. And I don't know, I want to continue reading it. But the introduction, yeah, it's amazing. The axioms are really interesting. Not all of them are created equal, though.
Yeah. My kind of general thoughts on the introduction, again, long, very long. But you can kind of see how Sedgwick is thinking through these axioms and really trying to think and set up the rest of the chapters. Because the rest of the chapters, once you read that first chapter, you really understand it. They do make sense in the way that Sedgwick is thinking. We'll kind of get to it soon, but the chapter 2, I have thoughts. But I can see why Sedgwick would write that chapter like she does, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's very interesting. I think it's there's some bits that are really drawn out.
Yeah, there's some bits that you're like, okay, we get it. I think in other ones are holding a mirror to America in the 1990s. Like, I ran into this quote that says, "A lot of popularity of the homosexual panic defense seems to come simply from the ability to permit and place by pathologizing the enactment of a socially sanctioned prejudice against one stigmatized minority, a particularly deemed among many." End quote. That's a hefty quote. I wish she would have expanded more. But I think it's cementing, like, the fear of the binary. And I think a lot of younger people listening to this right now would be like, why is it a binary? Well, because for a long time it was. Bisexuality wasn't looked into at all. And I think that is where Epistemology of the Closet also is a really good text. Because when I was younger, there was a quote that was "bi now, gay later." And, the binary still kind of functions that way, specifically within heteronormative circles, where if you're in a non-heteronormative circle, there's more choices or more acceptable narratives for your sexuality. Before we began recording, I was also talking about the Newsweek 1995 cover, in which it said, "Bisexuality, not gay, not straight, a new sexual identity emerges." And this wasn't till 1995. So while some of this might sound outdated, I think it's going into the foundations of the spectrum of sexuality. And even though she doesn't want to say it, also the spectrum of gender and gender identity. How do you feel?
Do you know what's funny? I've only just clocked that was in 1995 and I was born in 1995. It really gave birth to me.
Wow. God said, you are born bisexual.
But do you know what's really interesting? Because this still happens today, right? Mm-hmm. We are saying why binaries and this is happening more and more. But you still get it where, say you look at a historical person in the past, right? And they were married to they're a cis man married to a woman, but then they have sexual relations with men. Oftentimes people will be like, oh, well, they were in the closet.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about the closet today. They were in the closet. It wasn't acceptable at the time to have a sexual relationship with a man, so they were obviously gay. And you're like, actually...
A friend of Dorothy.
And you're like, I mean, there are nuances. It doesn't have to be like straight or gay, which is what Sedgwick is kind of saying.
Yeah, and it's also, I think it's interesting that she's calling it the homosexual panic, because it is, we are living with the homosexual panic. People think that, like, gay people getting married or non-heteronormative couples getting married is a danger onto themselves, and, like, this introduction is basically saying, if you're so scared of this, what is wrong with your identity? Because this doesn't affect you. And we're going to be going on about this chapter, because this could have been 2 chapters.
Yeah, like,
she's heavy.
It's a lot, and we're about to talk about more in depth this chapter, and it's going to be weighted a bit more towards this chapter. Like Paolo was saying, it really sets everything up. So one of the things I think we're touching on and skimming on is this idea of the limits of language to speak to our own existence, right? You can really only convey your identity in a Western context with the language that you have. Even now, we've spoke about this a little bit, but the ideas of certain gender identities and certain sexualities, they don't quite fit. I was even speaking to my partner about this, about bisexuality. I took that label because that was what I grew up with. I'm not just attracted to like either men or women, which is what bisexuality for some people implies, right? Mm-hmm. Even the identity labels for one person will not mean the same thing for another person. So it's really complicated.
Yeah, and it's why I like the LGBTQ plus. I mean, I would love to recite the alphabet mafia, but in everyday conversation, it does get quite clunky, and that's the limitations of language. But even pronouns, which is more dealing with gender rather than sexuality, we're all learning new pronouns, how to use them, how to involve them in our vocabulary, how do they translate to other languages. And this introduction is introducing.
I tried to avoid that earlier.
Yeah, but yeah, limitations of language. Which, oh my God, I can't believe he's like the boogeyman of queer studies. Foucault writes on language.
Like over our shoulder, like.
Yeah, he's my personal boogeyman. A lovely boogeyman, I will say.
One of the quotes that kind of captures what Sedgwick is trying to say about language and identities happens on page 22. So she says, even people who share all or most of our own positionings along these crude axes may still be different enough from us and from each other to seem like all but different species, right? Mm-hmm. This idea, this axiom 1, this idea that we are different, we're different from each other, right? Even if we're the same in every kind of identity way, intersectionally we are similar. Actually, we're going to differ because we're different people, raised different ways. There's much more.
Like identical twins are different. Mm-hmm. They have their own personalities. They have their own ways of living, even if biologically they're basically the same person.
Yeah. Basically, one of the things that Sedgwick says is to label somebody as an identity which they don't accept, which doesn't express them and their own feelings about their identity. She calls it the most intimate violence possible. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really beautiful way of saying it's complicated. Please do not. Yeah.
Well, we were also talking about this before, but I engage with this a lot in my own studies, mm-hmm, where, a lot of the photography that I look at, there is no author. I have no way of knowing who these people were. And even if I do not know their most intimate thoughts. So I never try to describe them as a specific sexuality or even gender. I usually say soldier or military personnel. If I know the name, Sergeant whatever, Reichsführer whatever. But I never try to use queer theory to describe who they are, but instead the activity in which they are engaged in. So in my work, I usually call it non-heteronormative performance. And it can be either a literal performance, they're putting on a play, or it's the performance of a gendered activity. So cross-dressing and dancing and doing a drag type of thing. And, what these weren't really permitted, so you don't really know what the actual identity of these people are. And to some degree, it doesn't really matter.
So it kind of reminds me, actually, of, I was recently writing about molly houses, and I won't go into it too much because it's long, but molly houses were kind of bars and clubs, kind of like pubs and cafes where homosexual men and other people, let's say, who used to go in 18th and 19th century England, particularly in London. That's where we know the most about them. But one of these kind of non-heteronormative performances. Yeah. So these people used to go and literally enact births. So they used to sit, and there used to be nursemaids, and they would give birth to a rock or a doll. And we only really know about these because of court records. So we don't really have their voices on these things, but what do you call that? What was that?
That was the exploration of birth. We've been doing that a lot. But yeah, and it's like, yes, you can go through police records. There's a really good essay from last year's issue of German History Society Journal. And they were looking at, it was this person that was arrested in the late Weimar Republic era to rise of the Third Reich. And he was remarked as he, but his passport said he, she. And he was arrested for dressing in the wrong gender clothing. So they wanted to call it cross-dressing, but it wasn't cross-dressing if they identified as a specific type of person. But, the language isn't there for that person to call themselves trans. It's like, what do we do as historians? We don't want to misgender, but also by gendering, we're also misgendering. Yeah. It's a catch-22 of gender. But this is, I think, a very long roundabout way of getting back to this point.
Yeah, it's complicated, basically. And I think it's interesting to bring up these specific examples because it's taking what can sometimes be very abstract things that Sedgwick is saying, less so in the introduction, but sometimes a little bit more abstract, and putting it onto more specific examples. There's a quote here. I'm going to kind of bring it out, not out of nowhere, it's also talking about the limits of language to speak to kind of our own existence. I just want to dig into it a bit more. So It's on page 26, and Sedgwick says, "Where would the whole astonishing and metamorphic Western romance tradition, I include psychoanalysis, be if people's sexual desire of all things were even momentarily assumed to be transparent to themselves?"
You hear that, Freud? Just coming after you.
Basically, the way I'm reading it, and maybe I'm wrong, the idea of Western romance is that it's a surprise. You fall in love, you fall for people. And if you were highly aware of your own sexual desire, the fall wouldn't happen. You would just meet somebody and know. But that's not how it works. So it must be more complicated than that, right?
Yeah, I can see that. And it's also falling in love and is gendered. There is the chase, and it's usually the male person chasing the female person and him trying to convince her. And even let's talk about Romeo and Juliet. Actually, it's one of my favorites because before the window scene when she's talking to her nurse, if I'm remembering correctly, this is going all the way back to high school. There's a part where she's telling the nurse that she wishes to tie a ribbon around her beloved's foot or leg so that they can only fly only so far away from them. And it's just it's a very dark thing for a 12-year-old to say. But it is going into those types of complicated relationships. Literally, they both die, and we're supposed to be romantic. So romantic. Oh my god, they were not meant to be literally. No, it was not enemies to lovers. They were just lovers.
Instantly.
But
lovers at sight.
Lovers at sight. Yeah, but if we think about what you said, Western romance like that, it's extremely gendered. There's roles to be played by each of those players. But when you look at homosexuality, male, female, non-binary, all the possibilities that are not within that cis male, cis female structure, it doesn't work because who chases who falls down? Do they both chase? Do they both fall? It's very, very complicated. And even so, if it's complicated within straight presenting, of course it's going to be complicated for everything else. So, and I agree.
Yeah. So hopefully these roundabout discussions are kind of pinpointing a little bit how complicated it can be to talk about things, to talk about anything, to kind of discuss sexuality, to discuss gender, to discuss anything, right? It's really complicated. Yeah.
And when you take into account the closet, when you add all this in, if you're hiding part of you within that closet, you're not going to be behaving in the Western approach to romance.
So, kind of the next thing I kind of wanted to talk about in this introduction and I might have you lead this, Paula, if that's okay, is this discussion of this born this way narrative. Let's begin with talking about post-Stonewall, queer joy, queer celebration, queer pride. We're in Pride Month, right? Not specifically Pride, though. We're not getting into it.
I think it's really interesting because even up until the mid 2000s, actually let's stretch it till the 2010s. I remember always hearing like, oh, it's just a man in a female body, or these sort of narratives that are trivializing identity, like both gender and sexually. And specifically in the States, there were these ads that were like trying to correct society from using things as like gay as like a slur to mean another slur, stupid, dumb. Things that we don't like to use, but it was those two things that were equated, and, the aughts are notoriously horrible for this. But, it came from a good place, but it did perpetuate these stereotypes that you are born this way. It's adding medical language where it's not needed. It's going back to, like, how homosexuality was deemed a mental disease. So equating it like, oh, you're just born this way. It's like, oh, you're defective. Since your birth, you have been defective. So I agree with Eve. I agree with Eve. Bestie Eve. I agree. I think there is something wrong with saying that. However, how else would we describe, other than like, oh, it's natural, and like, but that is still biologically based.
Yeah, it's trying to naturalize it.
Yeah, it's something that is already natural. You don't come out of the closet as a straight person. It's just deemed to be the status. But in coming out or expressing yourself in non-heteronormative constructs in terms of your sexuality, you have to reinstate your own normality. I wish we had someone like the history of medicine here for this one. Because it's beyond my own studies. I do history of masculinity, which is more societal based and like environment and masculine structures and blah, blah. I think actually the entire introduction is kind of stepping away from the medical terminology of homosexuality.
So I can't speak about this from a history of medicine point of view, but I can talk about it from a historical point of view. Around kind of this essay's time, we were talking about queer theory, but queer history is also happening. The earliest kind of example that I know of, and people might question it, I'm not sure, but in 1968, McIntosh wrote something called Homosexual Role in the journal Social Problems, and that is like an early example of this queer history narrative. And what I mean by this queer history narrative is before this kind of academic change, there was gay and lesbian history. And gay and lesbian history was really focused on finding us in the past. It wanted to find gay and lesbian people. So there's almost this wanting to find this ancestry in the past, right? This gay and lesbian ancestry. Because if people in the past existed, it legitimized your own existence in the present. But queer history turns around and says, what was gay 100 years ago, 200 years ago, is not gay now, and some of these words didn't even exist. And so to label people in the past is incorrect. It's ahistorical to be doing this. And to define these kinds of histories by our modern terminology is incorrect. And so queer history really starts to, when I'm talking about queer theory, it kind of goes hand in hand, right? It's this pushing of these boundaries, it's really questioning it. And if you're interested in understanding this a bit more, Querying the Modern Homosexual by Jeffrey Weeks is a really good intro. It's a journal article. Again, sorry, it's behind a paywall. But it's a really good introduction into queer history. How it came to be, why do this history then if it's not trying to find us in the past? So, the next kind of bit I want to speak about, and it might be a little bit, is it controversial?
Oh.
Is it dramatic?
Is she the drama?
So Sedgwick is obviously a straight presenting woman writing about male homosexuality. We've spoke about it a few times. There's two quotes I kind of want to bring in to give you a sense of Sedgwick's point of view on who gets to write about who. Mm-hmm. One quote is from page 39, quote, "Any gay male-centered theoretical articulation could only be done from the point of view of an alternative feminocentric theoretical space, not from the heart of the male-centered project itself." And page 59, "Realistically, what brings me to this work can hardly be that I am a woman or a feminist, but that I am this particular one. Realistically, it takes deeply rooted, durable, and often somewhat opaque energies to write a book. It can take them, indeed, to read it. It takes them, as well, to make any political commitment that can be worth anything to anyone." So I think there's interesting questions in here that, Paolo, you might want to speak more
I have
towards.
some hot takes.
Yeah, about who, when we're thinking about positionality, who gets to write about who and why?
Oh God, Eve! Like when I read that, I was like, oh, homegirl, no, homegirl, no, because it's basically saying, I'm sorry, I know that I'm writing about gay men, but as a white woman, I know more than you. Is basically what that first quote is saying, and the audacity. Like, I don't think anyone would say that now. Obviously, this work is older than the two of us, so not all of this is going to age well. And honestly, it's good that it didn't age well in some regard, because that means there's progress. So I completely disagree with the first quote. It's ridiculous. When we talk about our own work, we make sure to address our own positionality. I am a Latina woman that grew up quite comfortably in both Puerto Rico and in the United States. And I grew up in like the South, and then I went to university in the Midwest, and now I live in England. That is a very strange perspective. So when I'm talking about what I write, I say, hey, I am not of your culture, I am not of your gender. However, I have these interesting points. Take it or leave it. And you sort of engage with that kind of stuff as well with yours, where you're like, hey, I am a white British woman. I have perspectives. I have relationships with a museum in a very specific way because of my environment. And here's the hot take that I have. What Eve Sedgwick is doing here is causing rifts to make a point about the closet and its divisiveness. And I think the text would be better without the quote. It doesn't add anything. And I think Eve is just speaking to people quite patronizingly. And it's sort of infantilizing. Like, hey, I'm an older woman, I know more than you. So yeah, it wasn't needed, it doesn't add anything. It detracts from the text. The second quote, I am kind of conflicted.
I understand that it takes a certain kind of energy to write a book, but it also involves a certain kind of privilege to write a book. And it feels like she's going, well, it doesn't matter that I'm a woman or a feminist. I'm this particular person, which makes sense. She is this particular person writing a book.
And her first axiom is about how people are different.
Yeah, but to not acknowledge, well, you don't even have to acknowledge, you don't need to bring it up. Sometimes Sedgwick kind of does this, though. I see it less so in this book, and I saw it more in Tendencies, which is more about the personal. Sedgwick does bring it in strange kind of ways in this text.
And I think I can speak on this as like someone that grew up in the States. It's an Americanism, specifically an academic East Coast Americanism, where they're like, I don't want to call it identity politics, but I'm making it identity politics. And it's kind of screwed up that she's making this also about herself so much, because, once more, this goes back to, this is being published in 1990. The AIDS crisis is happening, and queer people, not just men, queer people are dying. So it is not just a privilege as a straight presenting white woman, it's also a straight presenting white woman that is not at risk of this type of disease within the perspective of society. So for her to basically, this is near the end of the introduction, to have these like hot takes are absurd.
I think, and we were speaking, and I don't want to be too speculative, but we're missing some of the context, I think, of Sedgwick's life. We're not following Sedgwick around. We're not like there 24/7, right?
We're not a documentary crew.
Yeah, so I think this is being written for a specific reason that we're not following, because we don't know Sedgwick, we don't know Sedgwick's life like that. There might be a specific reason for it.
Yeah, but I think we can also end on this for this part of the introduction area, because like, well, wow, we've been on this introduction. It's one of those, like, she didn't want us to know about her life, but she's also including only parts of her life. And could it be an extended metaphor about the closet? Maybe. I would not put that past her. Even with a hetero-presenting relationship, there is still a closet. But that's adding a lot of ifs, ands, or buts to something that's never described. So if you're not going to put part of your life and not make your own personal life part of the book, why mention it?
Yeah. I think this is why I might like Tendencies more, because it's so personal. But yeah, why?
Yeah, epistemology is not about her. Because she started off the introduction saying, this is about male homosexuality. And then she's putting herself in it.
Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 are a lot shorter, and Chapter 2 we have less to say about. Chapter 1 focuses on this notion of the closet as a metaphor for gay existence. You are either in or out the closet. Sedgwick starts this chapter by discussing the 1973 legal trial of an 8th grade science teacher named Akinfora, who was removed from his teaching position when the school board found out he had been part of a pro-homosexual student group whilst in college. This legal trial really shows us this kind of double bind of homosexual life. Being in the closet means that there's a danger of being found out, but coming out can result in oppression. So there's always danger. And this idea of the closet it's a perpetual coming out. It's not a singular event, even though it's often spoken about as a singular event. You're constantly coming out.
Oh my God, yes. Like, this is coming from, I think, the two of us coming out to our families and having to consistently come out for the rest of our lives. There is no singular moment, like, I'm queer. You're like, I'm queer. It's a consistent thing. It's like, should I just wear a badge with a rainbow flag or something? Back to the introduction, this homosexual panic of like, it's always in our face. It's like, yeah, because we have to consistently come out. But also, what's really fascinating is the closet is a danger and a safe space at the same time. So we were talking about this project called Queering the Map. And if you look at, places like the United States, Europe, West, a lot of the narratives are actually quite beautiful. Like, there's some people that are like, I grew up in a religious household, and this is how I express like my queerness. But like, it's obviously coming from a Western perspective where the closet is not the same as, let's say, one of the accounts was from the Middle East. I don't remember which country, but it is illegal to be homosexual there. So the closet is a safe space in their everyday life, but digitally, there is no closet. Digitally, through this art project, this is a way for them to be outside of the closet. And it's not a coming out moment. It is a living your own identity moment. And using the digital space as like that door that lets people see in without you coming out. So you're still within the closet, but the door's open.
But also, it is a kind of virtual coming out, right? When we're talking about these moments of coming out, you can come out virtually, but not in your everyday life, to your family, to other people, right? So you've expressed your sexuality or gender identity in a way, and that expression is really powerful. I don't know if you have ever had this moment, but the first kind of moment that you express your queerness, either verbally or written or any kind of other way, is a really powerful moment, right? It is a way of coming out, I think.
Yeah, I can say to some of my own personal experience, when I realized I wasn't straight, I mourned, because it is sort of the death of what I saw to be my own identity. and the start of a new one. And it's good. I'm okay. Do not write me like my condolences. But it is like the rebirth of a new thing in your life. And it's something that a lot of heterosexual couples don't really have to deal with. Here's where I'm kind of like against Sedgwick. There is equivalence to coming out. It's just not form of sexuality.
She does touch on this, but then she focuses really on sexuality because she talks about, for a while, I think in this chapter, right? She talks about coming out as Jewish, and then she says where the sexuality thing kind of differs from that, and then she talks about, she did a talk about coming out as fat, which I think is interesting, but she doesn't really dig into it.
Meanwhile, I think the Jewish portion is actually much more interesting, especially if you're in like the evangelical right America, where Jewishness is seen as an evil, and like, if anyone comes for me, I'm sorry, but that's the truth. I grew up in the South. So it's one of those, like, once more, Sedgwick hints towards a really interesting point and then completely drops it. I want to say the first chapter 1, chapter 2 is a lot of Sedgwick doing that. She picks up these really interesting points, and she's doing the whole like David Lynch thing where it's just like, elaborate on that, and then she's like, no. One of the quotes I really like was when she is talking about Proust and the Bible, and she equates Amon's panic, and she says that the quote, "and if I perish, is a self-resolution to the fear of coming out initially." So it's just like, you know what, I've had it. If you hate it, you hate it. I can't do anything more, man. I cannot do anything more for you.
Halberstam writes about queer failure and this notion that being queer is to have failed already. When we're talking about heteronormativity, you have failed at being the norm. And so dealing with that failure and coping with the queer failure is really difficult. Yeah, it's difficult.
Yeah, well,
to take that step, it's hard.
Yeah, and it's going back. It makes sense why in the introduction she's going against the medical history approach to homosexuality, because it is equating your sexuality to being defected. So this is where like the long introduction starts actually playing out throughout the text, because I don't think we would have been able to reach this point, because we didn't mention, this is also the chapter that's called Epistemology of the Closet.
Yeah, this is self-titled.
yeah, this is like the lead single. This is the Beyonce.
Yeah. This isn't actually from chapter 1. I just think it's interesting to think about now that we're living in a really digital world. And, you know, there's so many people, actually, I'm getting ahead of myself, but there's so many people on TikTok. And I keep seeing these stories of, like, I've been out on TikTok for a while, and now my parents have found my videos, and so I have to take them down, or I have to do this, or I've been kicked out. And so on page 57 to 58, Sedgwick writes, "One of the things that can be said about the post-Stonewall gay movement, for instance, is that to the extent that it posited gay women and men as a distinct minority with rights comparable to those of any other minority, it served notice that at least some people were in a position to demand that the representational compact between the closet and the culture be renegotiated or abrogated. And that side of the needed progress cannot be mobilized from within any closet. It requires very many people's risky and affirming acts of the most explicit self-identification as members of the minority affected." And I think it's interesting to think about this mobilization. You can't mobilize within the closet. And I feel like we had a conversation earlier, but I think I'm going to go back on what I was saying, because now I've just thought about that TikTok thing. You have come out online. You're mobilizing from outside a certain closet, right?
Yeah.
But you're still in the closet in certain ways. So there's this almost like digital outing, this digitally coming out. Yeah.
This is going to be such a left turn, but hear me out.
Okay, I'm ready.
It's what happened with the YouTube internet sensations, Dan and Phil, where people were being absolutely disgusting about their relationship. Specifically teenage girls. they used it. Like, I'm a big for fan fiction. I'm not for real life people, specifically people on YouTube, because they're not celebrities. They are normal people that get popular because of X, Y, and Z. But I remember when they did their coming out videos, and you could tell it was relief and pain at the same time, because to a certain degree they were forced to out themselves because of the way people were interacting with them online. So while like people now are like, yes, you can operate within the closet digitally, it's like, no, this is still happening. And this was like, what, 10 years ago? Things are not getting any better.
And it happened, I think it was 2020, maybe 2019, with Nikki Tutorials came out as trans because she was being threatened.
And even more recently, literally, we're recording this in 2022, Rebel Wilson had to come out because an Australian newspaper was about to out her. I think it was Australian.
Yeah, I know it was a newspaper. And then their response, that was foul. Did you see the thing afterwards?
Yeah. Like, they were like, well, why are you hiding?
No, but they were like, why did you out yourself? Basically. Like, why did you do it before us?
I don't think this is beyond Eve's purview, but I think we're also accelerating very quickly towards such a divisive, I don't want to say LGBTQ plus community, but LGBTQ plus environment in which if you're not out is just as bad.
Yeah.
And it's like, this is where like the closet is a really interesting dynamic, because when Sedgwick is writing this, it's more about the fear of the heteronormative crowd reacting to you than non-heteronormative. And now it is the hiding from the non-heteronormative, where if you're not out of the closet, you're not doing your due diligence.
Yeah, literally. And there's caveats with it. But some of the pedagogical advice, pedagogy theory of teaching, as a queer person, is to proclaim your queerness so that other students feel comfortable in the classroom. People can't always do that.
It's also, people don't have to.
Yeah.
Like, if they don't want to, like, people do not owe you, just like non-binary people do not owe you non-binariness, people do not owe you their sexuality or their gender. If you want to be appropriate and ask, like, hey, what are your pronouns? Just do that. That's fine. But yeah, like, forcing people out of the closet, people have their own pace. And like, for the example of Rebel Wilson, she had been in a relationship with a man for a really long time. So this was her first time sort of dealing with this. And that takes a really long time to think through, even if you're 100% sure that you are a lesbian or that you are bisexual or whatever. It takes a long time to get used to your new norm. So I think we're recording this on Pride Month, and it's very interesting that this is coming up.
I think, and this is going to take us into a darker place, a scarier place, a deeper discussion. But
a darker closet.
But I think, what happened with abortion rights. We're recording this on the 25th of June 2022, right? So what happened with abortion rights yesterday?
Yeah, the overturning of Roe v. Wade.
Is scary. And people are terrified, and they did say this, they kind of want to overturn other things that has set a precedent for same-sex marriage, contraception, same-sex relationships even. This idea of the closet, it's still around. It's always still been around, but it might have a
trickle effect.
We're going to be thinking and talking about the closet, I think. Because, if this happens, right, it's a scary time. But if this happens and same-sex marriage, it becomes outlawed and same-sex relationships even become outlawed, we're talking about queer theory and queer academia. Even being a queer academic who writes on sexuality and gender, what would even happen, right? It has such a massive effect in loads of different spaces, loads of different ways. I saw somebody on Twitter yesterday and people were like, why are you panicking? They were like, make sure you've got your documents for your children. Make sure you've got your documents for your partner and for your house and all that stuff. Make sure you have those documents because it's coming. And that's Scary.
Yeah, because people are like, oh, like, what? So what if they can't get married? Like, that has a lot of impacts because that is like in a bureaucratic way that's also affecting benefits, travel, houses, mortgages, bank accounts.
Yeah, being legitimized by the state has effects.
And also people are like, oh, it doesn't matter, but like you have to remember these rights are so new. And like let's go even darker. Biracial relationships.
Yeah.
Were not legalized till very recently. I mean, for a long time in Puerto Rico, I would have been categorized as mestizo. And, you know, like, these things are really new. And, yeah, like, the closet doesn't seem like that big of a deal. But there's little mini closets everywhere.
Yeah. So the closet is a massive deal, right? Mm-hmm. It's not simple. It's not like, oh, a coming of age fun story, or not a fun story, because there is a lot of queer deaths in the media, right? The whole and when I'm talking about media, I'm talking about films. It's a, what is it called, the tragic queer story, right? Yeah, so it's not a fun time.
No. Can I also say, like, on page 85, she talks about regarding the tropes of gender. So Sedgwick writes, quote, differently coded in the homophobic folklore and signs surrounding those sissy boys and their mannish sisters, but also in the heart and guts of much living gay and lesbian culture, the trope of inversion. And then she says something in Latin, which means a woman trapped in the soul of a man's body, and vice versa. And like, end quote. And like here, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but here she's truly solidifying this. Like, she's also talking about the presentation of homosexuality even within non-heteronormative circles. It goes back to like the queer coding within film, where, you know, you couldn't portray homosexuality without it being the sinful character or the evil character.
Oh yeah, Disney.
Well, it goes before Disney. It goes to the Hayes Laws, I believe.
Yeah. It's just like an example, like a lot of people can think of Ursula from Disney as a
divine.
Yeah, it's based on divine.
In Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, you know, the main killer boy, our brains are mush today.
No, killer boy.
Killer boy. Is quite queer-coded and is played by an actual gay man. And he's portrayed as a little sissy boy. I'm doing little air quotes. Do not isolate this audio. But he's presented as a sissy boy who's obsessed with his mother and obviously has mommy issues. And, you know, at the end of the film, you know, is him like in like the mask of death sort of overlaying the scene. And it's going into this presence of equating, once more, homosexuality with that of the non-typical, the other, and something that is evil. The closet is a revolving door. We're currently
I'm attached to it, spinning around.
We're currently in a building that has a horrible revolving door entrance.
It's so slow.
It's so bad. And you know what? So is the closet sometimes. So chapter 2?
Yeah, chapter 2. Done with the closet. We got deep there. We got into it.
We got dark.
Yeah. But now we're going to talk about chapter 2. And let me summarize it. You have to have specific knowledge. Let me say this. You have to have specific knowledge to look at chapter 2. Let me go into it.
Yes.
Chapter 2 focuses on a character in Billy Budd, which is a text from 1891 written by American writer Herman Melville, who left this text unfinished when he died. So the character under discussion is Claggett, a gay policeman on a ship. Sedgwick talks about the relationship between Claggett, Billy, and the ship captain Vere. To cut a long story short, because we did look at this, and it is a kind of long story, and I am a little confused about this chapter.
I'm 100% confused.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about it, but we might just go off on a tangent. We'll see. But to cut a long story short, eventually Billy accuses Claggett of nefarious activity, and Vere intervenes by arbitrating the situation. And during an interrogation, Billy lashes out at Claggett and kills him. Sedgwick states that the stereotype of secrecy in homosexual identity and desire is heightened in Claggett's case because of his position as a policeman and by background events that are happening that include like mutinies on other ships. So there's this tension and stress and yeah. Sedgwick connects this to the ways in which heterosexual men are continuously policing their desire and the desire of others due to heteronormative masculinities and male-male relations. So that's what chapter 2 is doing.
It's not doing it well. Because when I first read this, I was actually quite excited because I thought she was going to mention the elephant in the room when it comes to sea voyages. A lot of like sea voyages, I think between the 1600s to the 1800s, there were sea marriages in which people within boats, like the men working these boats, would have like a deal in which they kind of acted like a married couple to take care of each other within the boat structure. So if one of them dies, they got the belongings of the other, or if they fell ill, they would like take care of the other. And it wasn't queer. It was situational. I don't want to call it queerness, but it was like a non-heteronormative relationship between men. It didn't mean that they were gay. It might have been, you know, the show that came out recently, Our Flag Means Death, kind of explores this a lot more, but you know, it is fiction. It is based on real people, but it is fiction. But there were sea marriages, and I thought she was going to go down this route. Because I think that would have been a really interesting dynamic of binarism, which is the entire damn chapter. Yeah. And yet, she just leaves it on the table in favor of something that I think doesn't add to the text.
I think potentially, and I'm gonna give Sedgwick the benefit of the doubt, right? So the chapter is like, yeah, so, some binarisms, but it's part 1 of some binarisms.
Oh yeah. We have not read part 2 because
we haven't read part 2 yet because it takes time to read these things, and you know, a 60-page introduction. We needed to cut it somewhere.
Yeah.
But so potentially, and I'm giving Sedgwick the benefit of the doubt. Maybe in our part 2 we'll be like, oh, it's really clicking, Sedgwick. That made more sense. But,
damn Eve.
So this quote, which kind of gives me the idea that this might be the case, is on page 92, and it says, it will move through a deconstructive description of the instability of the binarism itself, usually couched as the simultaneous interiority and exteriority of a marginalized to a normative term, toward an examination of the resulting definitional incoherence, its functional potential and realization, its power effects, the affordances for its mobilization within a particular discursive context, and finally, the distinctive entanglement with it of the newly crucial issues of homo/heterosexual definition. Long story short, Sedgwick is trying to deconstruct the idea of binaries itself, the idea that there is a for and against, a marginalized and normative term, right? Mm-hmm. It's not doing it in this chapter, but maybe.
This is a chapter in which the footnotes were much more fascinating than the actual work. Especially Billy Budd. I had never heard of this before.
No, and so this is the thing, right? Sedgwick is quoting other people and talking about other people who are reading similar things into... I haven't read these other people, right? So maybe not. But that are reading similar things into Billy Budd that Sedgwick is reading. Mm-hmm. But we read overviews, we had a look, and I'm not seeing it. So I was like, is this just almost like Sedgwick's fan fiction version?
It kind of felt like it. There was we were talking at length about this part about ejaculation.
Yeah, I was very confused.
Yeah, so part of this did feel like we were reading Eve Sedgwick fan fiction because we were going through Spark Notes and like plain, simple plotline reviews, and none of the situations that she's going into detail about the occurrences within the text actually exist within the text. So you have a quote.
Yeah, and I'm just going to content warning for the next, give it a minute, and then we'll come back. Sexual assault, content warning. So Sedgwick quotes somebody called Robert K. Martin, who summarizes the murder, so the murder itself. Quote, Claggett's desire for Billy is not only a desire to hurt Billy, but also a desire to provoke Billy, so that he, Claggett, can be raped by Billy. His false accusation achieves this purpose by finally provoking Billy to raise his arm. When Billy strikes Claggett, he in some way fulfills Claggett's desire. Claggett dies instantly, at last possessed by that which he sought to possess.
Yeah, and then when Billy is being hanged for this, he speaks the lines.
So she starts talking about ejaculation, but she's not talking about ejaculation, right? She's talking about almost like proclamation, but using the word ejaculation for proclamation. So Billy's like chill, calm, big chill vibes before he's about to die. No one really knows why. It's kind of weird. But just as he's like being hanged, he yells out, God bless Captain Vere. And Captain Vere is the one who gets him hanged for Claggett's murder. Mm-hmm. And so there's this whole conversation about the momentary paralysis of Vere's erectly rigid posture in turn comes. It basically talks about erection, orgasms. I am very confused at what Sedgwick's trying to say.
It is very Lacanian in her analysis of this, and we do not have enough time to introduce who Lacan is, what Lacan is, and why she's using Lacan here. But once more, like without the context of, I'm slightly familiar with Lacan because of my history of art background, but she's purposely making double entendres and working with juxtapositions of the stillness and the severity of the situation, like the cusp between life and death and the hanging, and to not go directly with Lacan, but the act of hanging and squeezing the neck and him ejaculating words and then ejaculating the words to this person's face
in front of people.
There is an exhibitionism. There is this like interesting choice of words and interesting scenario. And this is why we thought it was kind of reading like Eve Sedgwick fan fiction, because the tone and the way that it's delivered. It's a very odd chapter because I didn't really get it. Like, I'm like, okay.
I think this is one of those moments. We've spoke about it a little bit before. And maybe people are listening to this and going, you're so dumb. But I'm sorry if you've read Billy Budd. But I've not done that. And I'm not going to do that for a podcast like this, right? Like, I'm not going to read 12 books to be able to talk to you about one, right? Mm-hmm. And this is one of those moments where you have to have all this kind of knowledge, not only of theory, but also of specific texts and specific cultural things, I guess, that sometimes, especially in queer theory, are a little bit abstract.
Yeah.
Or like, they're not as well known.
Yeah, that paragraph in particular, I had to kind of sit with it. I was like, what the hell did she mean by all of this? And then I looked into my bookshelf, and it was 2 books. My Lacan book on the fundamentals of psychoanalysis or something like that. And then the other one was Anti-Oedipus by Guattari and what's-his-face? Deleuze. Oh, God, I'm a horrible art historian. But it was like in that moment, I was like, oh, this is what she meant. But it's because I had to have already this working knowledge. Yeah. But at the end of the day, what was this about binarisms?
This is what I mean. We might figure it out. Stay tuned, okay? Stay tuned. I promise we might get them.
One positive thing that I got out of it. We are queer feeling. Jack Halberstam. Bestie, we are failing you. One thing that I do have positive to say about this chapter, footnote number 5 is the most interesting part of this entire chapter, in which Sedgwick writes that the word pride is usually equated to queerness, but if you think about it, it's celebrated biblically as one of the 7 deadly sins. So the pride in your own sexuality is also interacting with the evil and the deadly. And this is, I think, solidified. The reason I kind of waited till we explained her plot for Billy Budd is Claggett's desires and wishes to provoke Billy kind of works in that way. In her interpretation of this book, it is pride. It is like, I can make you a trigger word, rape me because I provoke you, and then ends up in their own death. It is the pride in their own scenario, the pride in their own control over the environment. And I thought it was really interesting, and I was like, why is this a footnote? This is so fascinating. Eve, give us the text. Drop the text, bestie. Please, tell us more about this. This is really fascinating. And it's stuck in the footnote? Yeah. How dare you?
There was so many footnotes in this chapter. And, like, so many analytical footnotes.
Yes.
It's not even an explanation. It's, like, true analysis. So, I don't know. We have been joking for the past week about pride as a sin.
I mean, with the rainbow capitalism, maybe. It's an interesting way to describe this month, Pride. But yeah, it's one of those, we have to wait till the chapter 3 and see if this makes more sense with chapter 3. Because right now, I don't know what to do with it. I was really recommended to read this book. And so far, it had been making sense why it is involved in our studies and why we like it.
We might figure out in chapter 3, we might not. One thing I will say is the most I hear about Sedgwick's work is in relation to the axioms, and especially in relation to this metaphor of the closet.
Yes.
So that's what I hear the most. I wonder if this is potentially why, because unless you're studying, like, Billy Budd, I don't know, would you use it in this way? I will say a lot of queer theory comes from a literary point of view, so the analysis of text and the deconstruction of text.
Are we at the end?
We're on fan fiction. So after that, I feel like we bagged on Sedgwick a lot. I really did enjoy the introduction in chapter 1. Chapter 2 didn't do it for me, but that introduction in chapter 1 is worth it. You know, it's kind of worth the reading and really taking that in. So I enjoyed it. Oh, yeah, final thoughts.
My final thoughts are, I'm actually quite excited to see what else.
Yeah, where we go.
Where are we going with this? It's obviously a seminal work. If it had just been the introduction, it's just as important. Because the first chapter is actually amazing. It's a very good chapter. But I feel like the introduction is where the meat was. It gave you a lot to think about, good and bad. There were some parts, like we said earlier, that just did not age well. But that is the thing with the work from 1990. Just as the Benjamin work made us think about technology and how we use images in our everyday life, thus far it's making us think about our closets and, like, the things that we have, even the physical closet in our homes, the things we hide from others. It's one of the few times, and I think we've been really lucky, that the texts that we have chosen to take on for these first couple episodes are not just important in our everyday life, but things that are gonna carry over for everything else that we're going to be reading. So while this is a queer text, I think this is applicable to a lot of different theoretical works and everyday life.
So, just to end the episode, we're going to talk about fan fiction. I will say, mine's not really a fan fiction, but it's about fan fiction. It's finding Eve Sedgwick fan fiction. It's not.
It's really hard. So all you fan fiction writers out there, write.
Yeah, get on it.
Because
the closet? I'm sorry. Is that a wealth of information?
I'll start off with mine since it's the more traditional.
Yeah.
So I looked up Eve Sedgwick on AO3, and we got a couple of them. The one I decided has multiple chapters, and I believe it has been completed, and it has 3 chapters. It's called Real to Real by Lady Grange. And it is explicit, so if you are not into that kind of stuff, don't read it. So, funny enough, it is a heterosexual plotline. And where Eve Sedgwick is included, it is using Eve Sedgwick's dialogue of love within the work. Try to guess general fandom for this one. It's a left field. It's a heterosexual couple, and the fandom is real life.
Real life? So it's real life people. Is it One Direction? No, that's not. That's homosexual.
It can be heterosexual too. You can do like POV.
Is it a POV or is it two people?
Yeah, there's one person that's real, and the other one is an original female character. You were close with music, so I'll give you one more guess.
Ooh, oh.
It's a good game, isn't it?
Now I am thinking. Music?
70s. 70s. Yes.
I don't know.
Led Zeppelin.
Oh, okay.
It's the Led. I did not know that Led Zeppelin had a fandom category, and it stars Jimmy Page. So there is no summary, unfortunately. So I'm not going to be reading this, but it takes place in the autumn of 1970, and some of the tags are: the left tape reel is laced through the transducer and interacts with a magnetic field which imprints sound waves and onto the tape itself. The right reel then spools this tape in its roots. Reel comes from the Old English and refers to the reel of winding threads. It actually sounds really well written. So, you know what? I take it back. I might read this. I'm going to bookmark it. I love that each fan fiction that we mention, I'm like, I'm not going to read it, and then I end up reading it.
Yeah. So, my one is not fan fiction, but it's talking about fan fiction, and I haven't read it. So if you go in and it's problematic in any way, I'm absolving myself of that because I haven't read it. Right? It's the only thing I could find, but I think it's a paper by a student, maybe like an undergraduate or something. It says honors project, so I don't know what an honors is other than yeah, but it's somebody called Kara Hisatake who talks about the paper's called "Nothing Says I Despise You Like a Blowjob." Opening queer moments.
10 out of 10.
Opening queer moments for queer spaces in Harry Potter / fanfiction. And so the kind of abstract is this paper focuses on online / fanfiction, narratives written by media fans that take place between two male characters in homoerotic relationships. This person concentrates on Harry and Draco / fanfiction based on the Harry Potter series and analyzes two pieces of / fanfiction in relation to queer theory. The paper draws its conceptual framework from Eve Sedgwick's adaptation of René Girard's Triangle of Desire, Roland Barthes' writerly text, and Judith Butler's notion of dragon fantasy, connecting / fanfiction and queer reader responses in its transformation of dominant heteronormative media. In reading queerly or non-normatively, queer moments fans recognize in popular media exposes the erotic potential of male homosocial bonds. It sounds good, though.
It sounds good, but does it have Jimmy Page?
No, it's not.
But instead it has Draco.
It does have Draco.
I loved Draco when I was younger. I was like, he's such a bad boy.
No, because I'm sorry, but Draco turns into such a wet blanket by the end of the series.
I know, but listen, this was like the early 2000s. Green Day was on the air, the airwaves. I was listening to American Idiot, hating the war and Bush.
I also love the queering and discussing queer relationships within Harry Potter, considering J.K. Rowling is an awful person. More queer readings. With second-hand copies of the book. Do not be buying those copies.
No, it's as someone that owns a Harry Potter tattoo, I despise the woman, but damn, those books are good. Yeah. They actually helped me learn English. It's how I learned how to read. So it does hold a special place in my heart. So make trans fan fiction about Harry Potter and don't publish it because then she will sue you and she has money.
Yeah, don't do that.
But you know what? Write it on websites for free. Tag her in it. Mail her copies. And by post. By owl.
Owls. Do you know like that one scene in Harry Potter where all the owls are like throwing letters?
is just tons and tons of explicit fan fiction about Hagrid.
Amazing.
Or Hagrid and Nagini, the snake.
For God's sake.
And on that note, this has been the Tired Podcast.
Oh, thanks for tuning in. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Listening.
We're tired.
Thank you so much for listening to Theory-ish. We really appreciate it and would love to hear your thoughts. Check out our Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and Twitter at theoryish_pod for up-to-date information, and please rate, follow, and leave a review wherever you're listening to the podcast.
If you're interested in finding anything we have mentioned in the episode, please check our show notes or description to find more details. You can also contact us at theoryishpodcast@gmail.com.
See you next time.
Goodbye!